greater common good, which has underpinned South-South cooperation forever. Right? Most of us are well aware of the notion of national interest, and I think Professor Maudsley was mentioning this concept of the national interest. But in what way is this national interest being molded to meet our notion of the greater common good? In other words, to put it crudely, in what ways are we keeping aside our deadly disagreements, especially within our respective regions? And in what way are we able to still promote this greater common good? Often we are told that BRICS, for example, is a failure according to the Western narrative because India and China cannot get along and they are rivals for supremacy. Likewise, you have many ongoing geopolitical rivalries and conflicts that we have not yet found a means to subsume them within the notion of the greater common good. And I think the dialectic I don't agree with the Marxist framework, but the dialectic is an interesting notion here because still national interest versus greater common good, what are the new theoretical lenses we can focus on? I think that is something is important. We need cooperative champions within the global South, states as well as social forces that go beyond it. Let me just conclude by talking about the new institutions. We are all very proud of the new institutions that have come up at the level of South-South, and we know that they are distinct and unique and different. Dr. Sat Chaturvedi and I have been talking on TV a lot about how they are different from the post-Cold War and post-World War II institutions. But we have not yet developed abstract notions of the uniqueness of these new institutions. There's a lot of empirical content out there. I think the challenge for us in theory is to come back to say, in what ways are we still talking about them being non-imperialistic, equitable, green? Question mark. Are we green? Are these new institutions green? Are we based on Ubuntu and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam? And what else? What is the role of accountable governance? Internal accountable governance without quote-unquote interference from outside. Because again, if we were to problematize South-South, the weak link remains a lot of highly unaccountable and corrupt governments, ethnically divided societies, and we cannot deny those realities. I mean, we bristle at them when the global North points them out, but these are factors. And sometimes these are driven purely by domestic. I mean, look at the war in South Sudan. It's been such a disaster for the last 4 years. And it's been such a disappointment for those of us who welcome this new member into the Committee of Nations. And yet, we have not been able to really theorize how the new institutions can support peace building and conflict resolution processes. So my humble request is, while we are focused on development and poverty alleviation and rising from lower to middle income, all these are laudable goals, but the biggest obstacle we must think about is political. And a lot of the national elites of developing countries have been actually working to divide our peoples. And that is the fundamental reality which has not changed the last 40, 45 years. So where do we bring back this greater common good which will really bring the unity of the peoples of the global South? And how do the role of people and social forces come into our theorization, which is still state-centric or maybe at most corporate and multinational-centric? These are the big theoretical challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chaulia. I think your insights with regard to the theoretical construct as regards South-South cooperation, and you have also brought into our focus the heterogeneity within the South also, and also what are the distinctive features of the Southern institutions that we are talking about. I think very important contribution. Now we have open floor, Sachin. So we can eat into the lunch time, 10 minutes. Okay. Please introduce yourself, and if you have a question to the panel in general or particular one of our panelists, please mention. Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Andre de Melo e Souza from the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. I have 2 points, and I'll try to be brief. There seems to be a consensus in the panel that conditionality is no longer being applied in international development cooperation. This point was made by Anthea, it was made by Emma, and also by Paulo, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think that is wrong, but I think the statement perhaps needs to be qualified. What kind of conditionality we're talking about here? And this also has to do with the points that were made by Aristides. I mean, surely conditionality in what concerns human rights, models of good governance, or democracy, that is pretty much gone, I would agree. But there still are important economic conditionalities that have always been there, including in South-South cooperation, and political ones. If we look at the so-called recipients or partners, if you will, of China's international development cooperation and their voting patterns in the UN, we see that there is a significant correlation there. And that's not a coincidence, I don't think. It would be naive to suppose so. So that's my first point. The second one has to do with global governance. And the panelists, as well as Professor Acharya earlier this morning, seem to have an optimistic view of this governance, in as much as now we have new institutions, right? We have the NDB, we have the AIIB, and if there's a mismatch in terms of the distribution of power and the prevailing institutions from the post-World War order, now we have new institutions emerging that somehow seem to correct that. My question would be, what are the effects of that in terms of efficiency globally? I mean, that in itself might be a positive outcome, but it leads also to greater fragmentation. So again, what is the impact of that for the efficiency in the provision of global public goods? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the two questions. Yes, sir, please. Is there someone on the behind? Okay. Yeah.
Very briefly, Chair, thank you very much. Rajiv Bhatia, former High Commissioner to South Africa. I have questions to, just one question actually to both Mr. Steves and Mr. Sitas. We are all supporters of IPSA and BRICS, but I think somebody has to point out that the emperor doesn't have clothes. IPSA program is very tiny, and it has been like this for a long time. So we can certainly sing its paeans, but we must remember that the scale is very small. And BRICS, every year it is holding summits in various neighborhoods. It meets the leaders, but is still yet to start financing development projects outside BRICS membership. And this is creating its own sense of frustration all around the world. How do you feel we can fix this in terms of facing the challenges of new development cooperation paradigm? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia. At the back, yes, at the back, and then yourself, and then we will close, yeah. Oh, you have a question? Okay. Please, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. I think what I found, Philani Mthembu from the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. Found it interesting, Paulo, the mention that Buenos Aires, at least 40 years ago, could be seen as a victory in essence for ODA. And that we then went through kind of like a 20-year period where South-South cooperation was basically forgotten. Now, as we go to 40 years after, whose victory will it be? Will it be a victory again for ODA in adjusting to South-South cooperation? Will it be a victory for South-South cooperation in shaping North-South cooperation? So whose victory are we moving towards?
Thank you. Yes, over there. Yes. Over here, and then last one. Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, mine is a small comments about unless we have a political understanding, you cannot have a economic understanding, because we have a lack of political understanding. Recently, the way Ambassador pointed out, BRICS, our members of BRICS are trying to unstabilize democracy in India and rest of the world. So why not to first understand politically?
Thank you very much. And then last comment, please, from the floor.
Hi, my name is Karthikeya and I work at RIS. My capacity of questioning is basically of a 21-year-old who has a stake in the future of the Global South. My question, the first one is to Mr. David. Basically, when you said that the DFIs within India were commercialized in 94, and in 94 China created more robust DFIs. My question is particularly, is there a way to incentivize the commercial banks or the investment banks to invest in the development infrastructure of their own country with partnering with the government so that they have a stake in the future? Is there a way we can incentivize that, sort of promise them a stake in the future of the government, the development of a nation, which is fairly ambiguous, but I guess you're a banker, so you would give the perfect way to incentivize a banker who would be interested in profits, but as well as national development. My second question is, again, more from a youth standpoint. I'm hearing all of this nomenclature, which is extremely encouraging, that this is not a donor-donee relationship, it's a development partnership. But empirically speaking, how do we, so basically the advent of this entire phenomena of SSC is a result of South countries feeling left out from the global development regime and seeing the North countries skyrocketing in their GDPs and development. How do we ensure that within the global South, countries which are not developing as fast but are still part of this structure, which is not yet, this is why we're here, which is not yet theorized, it's very contextual. The southern countries, let's say the LDCs or countries in Southeast Asia, they do not feel left out, and they do not eventually opt out of South-South cooperation, form a regime of their own, like the Global South has now. I guess this could be a general question to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Now that the youth of India has spoken, we can now get back to our panelists. Thank you for that question. Let me give my panelists and commentators maybe 1 minute, huh? 1.5 minutes, okay? Professor Mohant, why don't you start? Yeah? 1.5 minutes, please. Huh? I won't have time to warn you, you know.
Yes. To the question on conditionality, it's a fact that in many programs, we find that there is conditionality applicable to many developing countries. As you know that from various theoretical foundations, that you really cannot prove that with conditionality, we can really have sustained growth. And we also see that with the various development program, we can sustain growth. Therefore, it is really required is that constant evidence to show that there is no room for conditionality in terms of pursuing growth in developing countries. I think it is to be pursued. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think you're comparing apples and oranges. Nowhere in the world, nowhere, will a commercial banking system be looking at financing long duration infrastructure projects or even industrial projects. They're not geared for it. Their resource base is primarily short term, not long term, which means they run an asset liability mismatch. They don't have the skills to appraise it. So you're asking somebody to do a job which he's not geared for. You do need development financial institutions. There's no shortcut. The second part of your question, how do you incentivize? You know, at least using India as the basis, I think you need to first create an element of trust. Because if you're bringing the private sector, you spoke about investment banks, I presume you mean generally private sector institutions. If you're going to bring them into what is effectively a PPP structure, then there has to be that confidence in the judicial system and in the government as a regulator. Because in a PPP, your government is a counterparty and is also a regulator. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is significant cases of regulatory capture, which tilts the playing field and then the private sector stops believing. The last point on what is the remedy. Look, I think we give insufficient credit to the Indian saver. Whenever there has been a bond issue in the Indian market, and I'll ask you to go back maybe 3 years to the tax-free bonds, we're probably the only country in the world, though I don't have data to back up the statement, where a fixed income bond issue to a retail investment base was oversubscribed massively. So if you have a reliable rating agency system, the money is there, the investor is willing. We just need to have confidence and develop that bond market. Very short answer, but I hope it serves.
Thank you.